Oh. Oh. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here today to discuss the controversy over critical race theory. The idea that somehow the United States is dominated by whiteness and somehow whites are overlords over everybody else and rule everything. The fact is, this is simply not the case, and there are many ethnic groups, many types of Asian groups, for example, that earn far more than the average Caucasian. Now, the first problem that you'll encounter when looking up the statistics is that it's difficult to find overall earnings, overall home ownership rates just on the basis of being Caucasian. Now, why is that? Well, we'll take on whiteness. The critical race theory thing that there is somehow some kind of whiteness is simply false. Obviously, we know that just because, and it should be obvious that this is racist, that just because people look alike, that they have the same skin color, hair color, and eye color, does not mean that they have the same culture. Blondes and redheads do not have the same culture. And the idea that they do, well, it's something called Pan-Aryanism, the idea that there's a fortress Europa and some unifying influence among Caucasian groups simply isn't the case. When you look at historical Caucasian culture, I mean, basically European history can be boiled down to two words: tribal warfare, with castles, of course. I mean, when you look at a continent, Eastern, Western Europe, from Kamchatka to London, okay, Moscow to Macedonia, there are hundreds of languages, at least a dozen linguistic groups. These people can't even communicate with one another. I mean, if you look at, say, Russia, Finland borders on Russia. There's a complete disparity in linguistic groups. The Basque live in Spain. The languages are unintelligible. And when you try to look for Caucasian Americans, what happens is, as a group, they are extremely the groups break down by ethnicity, not race. Ethnicity, it turns out, and lifestyle, the location where you live, your geography, population density are far, far more important to determining your socioeconomic status than your race. I mean, people used to call, for example, Far East Asians Orientals, and Chinese and Vietnamese, Koreans and Japanese, they were all the same. Of course, we know that's foolish. We know that if you go to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, that there are more languages spoken there than anywhere else, and there are huge differences between the earnings of Africans both in Africa and the United States. I mean, if you look at what people earn in Rwanda versus what people earn in Somalia, I mean, the difference is enormous. So the United States does not have any ethnic group, religion, or culture that numbers greater than 50% of the population. And if you break it down by race, that tells you very little about their behavior. Even Caucasian groups from the old country that border on one another have enormous differences there. I mean, if you look at, say, the source Insider Monkey, and they list the top 7 most powerful ethnic groups, only Russian Americans and Australian Americans even break the top 7. Russians are only number 7, and their salary per year is only $77,349 a year. Australians, on average, only earn $81,452 a year. Now, we can contrast that with, let's compare this to Japanese Americans. Despite many immigrants from Japan being from the nuclear fallout zones because their countrymen found them to be unclean and impure, and despite being placed in internment camps in World War II, Japanese Americans earn more than Caucasian Americans. Their average salary is $85,800 a year, and most of these stats are from 2019. The home ownership rate is 59%, The unemployment is 4%. When you look at, and one of the few numbers I found was overall Asian men versus overall Caucasian men. Asian men, as an average, earn 117% of the salary of white men. And that would be about overall $98,174 a year versus $76,057 a year. And you might ask, what are the top two groups in the country? Well, overall, if you look at Jewish Americans, the average salary, of course, is $97,500 per year. Compared to whites, this is just, when you look at this just nukes the typical white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Caucasian. But what is the most successful group? You might say, well, Jewish Americans tend to be Caucasian and there's bias and privilege. But this is not the case. The number one prosperous ethnic group in America are Indian Americans. And I'm not talking about Native Americans. I'm talking about India that borders on Pakistan and China. The salary per year is an incredible $120,000. Like the Japanese, home ownership is 59%, unemployment is 4%. This is absolutely incredible. Now, when we look at India, this is a fairly diverse bunch of people. We're not just talking about immigrants that are the high-class Brahmin Indians. We're talking about all Indian immigrants, from the Dalits, who are untouchable, to the Brahmins. And, of course, there's a discrepancy between these groups, but overall, Indian Americans are far darker than Japanese or Jewish, or certainly darker than Caucasian Americans. In fact, many of them are as dark as Black Americans. Not that that matters only to woke-tards and critical race theorists. The idea that you have to be white to succeed in this country, or that whites somehow occupy a superior socioeconomic status, is ridiculous. Now, of course, by virtue of their numbers, 68%, of course, most of the revenue generated, over 50% of the revenue paid to the government, of course, is, it is, but not because whites are pretty productive. They're not, but just because there's a lot of them. If you look at poverty rates, for example, white versus Black, the majority of Americans in poverty are white, and that's about 12%. If you look at Black Americans, it's a little bit more. It's about 25 to 30%, although it fell a lot during the Trump years. Again, another statistic that's interesting that I found, if you compare Black Americans with intact families where there's a mother and a father in the home, versus Caucasian Americans with a single parent home, like for female-headed, Black Americans from good families earn more than their Caucasian counterparts, even though it is traditionally thought that Black Americans struggle more than many other ethnic groups. So having an intact family is far more important than being blonde. The fact is, in a capitalist secular society that is a meritocracy, you simply cannot get by on your looks and your appearance. This is ridiculous. So there's no one ethnic group for whites. Whiteness as a social construct doesn't exist. Their Caucasians have very different ethnicities from one another. They differ from one another a lot. In fact, many Caucasian ethnicities are more similar to minority populations. If you look at Caucasian populations from many of the Eastern European countries that are ex-communist, that came from a position of poverty, many of the demographics for these groups are far closer to Cuban Americans, or even Colombian Americans, or Venezuelan Americans than they are to Indian Americans. You look at say, Poland, it's Catholic, Eastern European, very similar. So there really is, America really is a multicultural country. There is no overarching theme of whiteness. And the only reason why the taxes and revenue are paid by whites is just by numbers. Now, being the majority of the population, I mean, there are things that Caucasians could do, but they're not realistic simply because of the ethnic and political diversity within these groups. I mean, if you look at, say, voting, Democrat versus Republican, it's usually 45% to 55%. The votes of men cancel out the votes of women. And oh, by the way, when you look at voting men versus women, women are the majority of registered voters. 53% of registered voters in America are women. It's not hard to see, and it's not hard to see why. I mean, women live 10 years longer than men. Of course, you can't vote if you're dead unless you're in swing states with Dominion machines by Democrats, of course. Now, and women have a lower crime rate. Women also have much lower rates of disabilities and on-the-job injuries and mental illnesses that would interfere with their voting. So men, as a whole, are not the voting majority. The feminists claim they're a minority. Now, setting aside the women in math jokes, this simply isn't the case. If women could somehow agree to vote together, they could get whatever they damn well please. Now look at whites. Now, in order for whites to act as a bloc, you'd have to really eliminate multiculturalism among Caucasians. This doesn't necessarily mean that all Caucasians are going to earn the most money. In fact, if you did, the salary would drop. But what could the majority of the population do that others can't? Well, first of all, in theory, the majority of the population could throw a tax revolt. Listen, they could tell the government, listen, you're going to do what we say, what you're told, when you're told, how you're told, or we're cutting off your money. You ain't getting nothing. Your super weapons will rust. The second thing that a majority of the population could do is to, go on a nationwide strike. And this has happened in monocultural societies. If even, half the number of Caucasians walked off the job and picketed in the streets, or even worse, rioted, of course, the country would grind to a halt, and that group, of course, would be able to essentially lay down an ultimatum and, force society kicking and screaming to do what they want. Of course, this won't happen because, again, multicultural ethnic groups with profound philosophical, religious, and ancestral differences simply cannot agree on this point. I mean, do European or white Americans have a common culture? No. Now, ethnicities do. Serbian Americans have a culture, Italian Americans have a culture, Russian Americans have a culture. But overall, there is no common culture. The pan-Aryaist idea of whites being Fortress Europa, and as a result of being Fortress Europa, have somehow or other constructed an invisible crypto-Reich that rules over everyone else, simply does not hold up on the basis of evidence. Caucasian Americans cannot take over the country. And we have, between the left and right, two competing conspiracy theories. On the right, with Trump, you have QAnon, the idea that there are a bunch of satanic pedophiles that rule the world and have taken over the world and have imposed their will. Now, on the left, of course, with CRT, of course, you have another conspiracy theory, that there is a Fourth Reich, a crypto-Reich, comprised of Fortress Europa that has ruled the United States and the Western civilization. I mean, if that were true, you ought to be able to answer a few questions. Who is the supreme leader and maximum overlord of the entire white race? How did this overlord manage to conquer the entire white race without their knowledge? And if you want to argue that whites are structurally racist, of course, most whites don't consent to being racist. How would this supreme overlord somehow force all Caucasians of such diverse philosophies of life to be subconsciously racist against their will and without their consent? I mean, this is impossible. It's on the face impossible. And upon a cursory glance at statistics, simply can't happen. But we have to ask ourselves one question. What would a monolithic white culture look like? How would America be similar? How would it be different? Well, first of all, when you have a monolithic majority culture, even if you have free elections, the political parties typically dissolve into one dominant party, even though many countries, and be a free country, it's going to be a one-party state. I mean, if you look at Russia, for example, very good example, the majority of Russians are members of the Orthodox Church. They support Vladimir Putin's party. Their symbol, for example, is a double-headed eagle. And it essentially means that Christ and King are unified as a whole ruling Russia. There's no separation between church and state. By the way, Vladimir Putin goes to confession every day with Patriarch Kirill, who is essentially like the Pope of the Orthodox Church. So basically, Russia is a theocracy. That's what it would look like. Secondly, without infighting among themselves, you would see a lot of cultural commonalities. You would, for example, have much fewer TV stations and radio stations. You might have like white power television, and you would have the fringe nationalist songs being in the top 40. Uniforms, clothing, boots, jewelry would be very, very much for sale in stores. If you look, for example, at Islamic countries in Iran, I mean, the hijabs are the same, the men dress the same, the hairstyles are going to be the same. You would have a very, very uniform appearance among Caucasians. That's just the way it is. Nationwide strikes would be common. Collective bargaining would be common. Protests would be common. For example, let's take the case of Ashley Babbitt. We just found out today that Capitol Police Officer Lieutenant Byrd, who, by the way, is a black male, not that that matters only to woketards, shot Ashley Babbitt, who is a Caucasian female. Now, if you had a monolithic white culture, you would have massive protests in the streets and marching, and people would be able to become offended because they pretty much agree on other things. We haven't seen this happen. We just haven't. It just hasn't occurred. You would also see an isolationist type foreign policy. You would see a greater emphasis on social programs. For example, if you look at the Scandinavian countries, they're capitalist countries, but they have a big welfare state. These guys are very altruistic among one another. The libertarian individualist ethic isn't there. I mean, and people would favor this type of thing because basically they would view each other as distant relatives. We're all the same, and kind of we are, but it's not visible. So a monolithic, nationalist, racist white society would look nothing like the United States. It would look like other monolithic cultures. For example, if you look at China with the Han Chinese, I mean, there's the ethic of Confucius where everybody comes together and agrees on things. There's a lot more in-group altruism. If you look at Japan, another very monolithic society, I mean, there are courtesies and bowing and rituals for people greeting each other, and there's a very much more of a collective ethic. Now, a monocultural society need not be a poor society. You can still be you can be good world citizens, you can be prosperous, and the main aspects to prosperity are refraining from socialism and refraining from forming a theocracy, as long as your society is secular, meritocratic, and honors human rights. I mean, and doesn't fool around with the economy. I mean, you're going to do pretty well. I mean, multiculturalism, diversity doesn't really make it any better, any worse. And even if let's go back all the way into the past, the origins of the white people. The critical race theorists will tell you that African Homo sapiens went to Europe and that these were the first humans to live in Europe and that whites come from these guys. This is absolutely wrong. The Denisovanian species of human and the Neanderthal species of humans existed in Europe. They were far older than the Caucasian race. And when Africans went into Europe, of course, these people interbred and had interspecies sex, and a new race of people formed, and they bred true as Caucasians. If you look at the Caucasian genome, the Neanderthal genome has been sequenced. If you look at the Caucasian genome as a whole, you can pull from many individuals 41% of the Neanderthal genome. And of course, 23andMe, they tend to, they don't want to offend people, but even they admit that 2 or 3% of the Caucasian DNA is Neanderthal. The amount of Denisovanian DNA, or the amount of DNA between Denisovanians and Neanderthals, of course, is even higher in Caucasians. So even if you go back to the point of origins, are whites a pure race? No! They're hybrids. I mean, take a look at the animal example, coy dogs that are crossbreeds between wolves, coyotes, and domestic dogs that have, gotten out and they've formed a little bit of a new species. Essentially, Caucasians are very similar to that group. So no, this is not a racist society. This is not a white supremacist society. This is a society, a free society, a multicultural, diverse society, whether you like it or not. Now, the black supremacists will bang their boots on the table. No, there's a conspiracy, and, melanin makes us superior, and we're people of the sun and people of the ice, and we're better. Of course, the white supremacists will do the same thing. No, we're people of the ice, and this has given us discipline, and we've created all these ancient civilizations, and we are the light of the world, and they've had. But even if you look at racist, politically incorrect statistics like the bell curve, Caucasians do not come out on top. Asians do. Caucasians, in fact, the very few Caucasians are the average IQ of 100. There are many that are foolish, and there are many that are geniuses, but the tails of the Caucasian bell curve are much larger than the peak as compared to other groups. In other words, unless you think that, intellectually speaking, if you believe in bell curves, unless you believe that erratic, scatterbrained performance makes you superior, you can't conclude that whites are superior, even if you look at Russian and these very dubious, politically incorrect sources. I mean, when you turn off your emotions and look at the situation logically in America or the Western world, whites are not superior. Worldwide, whites are only about 10 or 11% of the world population. Asians and, African blacks and other groups far outnumber Caucasians. Now, what's a minority worldwide? 10%. If you live in a city like Baltimore, it's a majority-minority city, or a minority. Overall in the United States, well, Caucasians 68, 70%. So what's a minority? What's a majority? Even that's a very vague question. It's not, politics is local. But depending on how you zoom in and out, you can get different results. So these critical race theorists proposing that somehow there's this, racial concept and, are ridiculous. The main thing, one of the main factors that determines success in America is assimilation. Are you mainstream? Are you educated? Can you speak the language? How courteous are you to people? If a police officer pulls you over, are you going to be like, F you, MFer, or I'm sorry, officer, have a nice day, officer, I apologize. Well, how do you treat people? Are you courteous and polite? Far more important than what you look like. It's how you act. I mean, this woke-tard socialist idea that this critical race theory exists is ridiculous. The other thing in general theories, poli-sci, sociology, the hard sciences, most theories don't survive. Most hypotheses and theories become disproven over time. And when you look at critical theory, this is essentially, Marxism, class warfare. Well, we know that Marxist societies have the worst human rights record on earth, even worse than the Nazis. Now, I'm certainly not whitewashing the Nazis. I mean, they were unspeakably horrible. But the two biggest mass murderers in the 20th century were Stalin and Mao Zedong. Hitler, of course, came in third. Now, when you look at Mao Zedong killed, for example, 60 million of his own people. That's 10 times the Holocaust. Mao Zedong himself killed more people than Hitler and Stalin combined. And Nazism was basically the high mark of white supremacism. It's been on decline ever since. This is the idea that America is a racist society crumbles when you simply look at the evidence mathematically. And, yes, when things like that happen to George Floyd and you see hate crimes like Tim McVeigh, of course you have an emotional response. But when you look at the nationalists and supremacists, since when do you judge an entire race of people by the most alienated and least prosperous, by essentially the dregs of society? And does it make sense to judge black people only by those living in extreme poverty? Of course not. You have to look at the groups as a whole. Like Ben Shapiro says, facts don't care about your feelings. And this nonsense about critical race theory having any merit beyond the paranoid delusions of leftists and woketards is just that. It's nonsense. It's politically incorrect. And people, you have to understand another factor. People will live down to or up to your expectations. If you tell Caucasians, listen, you're just the oppressor, you're just racist, you can't help yourself, that's all you do is destroy things, well, people will live down to your expectations. Let's say you have a kid and you had a daughter, and from the age of 5 you told her you're stupid, you're a slut, you're a whore, you're ugly, no one will ever love you, you're worthless. Well, of course the kid's going to become a stripper, a prostitute, or a gang member, and she's going to live down to those low expectations. Accusing whites of being racist doesn't help whites. It harms them and it harms society. Typecasting people as victims, again, just causes race war. And if you look at civil war, well, they're not going to win. One thing, if you look at the one thing whites do good as, we have the majority of the guns. Why? Because we're the most people. Caucasian, most gun owners, there are about 85 million gun owners with about 300 million guns. And if you look at the bullets they have, there's literally 2 to 4 trillion bullets just in the hands of the civilian militia, unorganized militia in America. That's just not enough rounds to kill everybody on Earth, 8 billion people. That's enough bullets to kill every single human being that has ever existed. The idea that even if there's a supremacist plot, that somehow anybody, and of course most of the gun owners are white, that anybody's going to win a civil war is ridiculous. And by the way, the minorities are not always going to side with others. Many minorities are married into white families. Many minorities work or hire whites for their businesses. And many minorities have a lot in common with white ethnic groups with similar histories, more so than other minorities. So, a race war, it's not going to work. I'm sorry, the Black Panthers or La Raza Unida, in other words known as the United Race, which is a Hispanic supremacist group, you're simply not going to win a race war. In fact, nobody will, because if the United States broke up into a race war, Russia and China are going to march in and take everything. They'll win the race war. Now, overall, the United States does have a problem. We're not united. But there could be a radical solution. If you look at Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic and the Republic of Slovakia peacefully separated into 2 countries. It may come to pass that the southern states, such as Texas to Florida, bordering on the Gulf, may separate to form South, USA, and the northern states would then be socialist North USA. Of course, this would give the Democrats in D.C. majority control and give them essentially power forever. And of course, in the Patriot states, the other thing would occur. And basically people would vote with their feet. And the nice thing about this is that it's peaceful. You don't need a race war, won't solve our problems. Peaceable separation at some future point probably will. And this can be done without killing anybody or even harming the standard of living. You have people, they can't even agree on what a woman is or how many genders there are or whether global warming occurs. There's just no unity in the United States. And the leftists the socialists are responsible for this because they've used Alinsky rules for radicals tactics to destroy our country, or they will if we don't stop them. So the United States is a very troubled country, but it's certainly not a racist country. Anyway, this is White Lightning 777, signing out.